Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. This is episode 46 of Changing the Face of Yoga. I am talking to Lara Benusis today, and Lara is a graduate yoga researcher, and we're going to talk about research, which is becoming more and more important in the yoga world, about what kinds of research are there, what can we really find out from research, etc. This is part one of a two-part series. Let's listen. Hello, this is Stephanie Cunningham with Changing the Face of Yoga. My guest today is Lara Benusis, and she is a extremely experienced yoga teacher. She has over 12,000 hours of teaching and has been teaching since 1996, but she's also, very interestingly, a yoga researcher. And we're going to talk a lot about the yoga research status of today and what she's been doing and how she develops protocol for yoga research. Right now, she's a advanced master's student, a graduate researcher at Columbia University. At one point, she was the manager of the yoga and exercise program at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and that's in the United States, and it is a very well-known center for dealing with people that have cancer. So she teaches and researches the effects of yoga for cancer patients. And she also teaches in Japan twice a year for the largest wellness company in Japan. And she leads specialized yoga trainings over there. She's quite experienced in a variety of ways. And welcome, Lara. And is there anything else that you would like to add to that introduction?
It sounds great. I'm happy to be here with you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'd like to really start with your expertise in the research area. And let's first of all just find out why you decided to do yoga research in addition to all of your teaching.
I'm passionate about research, and it was never a path that I had expected I would be on ever. I started teaching in 1996, and in the beginning, I really taught a lot of dancers and athletes, and I even worked with the U.S. Olympic team here, the U.S. Olympic skiers from the U.S. Olympic ski team, I should say, because it wasn't like they were all, it was like I was at the facility. They actually just came to take my classes. And with more of like a healthy population. And then as my skills developed and as I just continued to teach, and about a decade into teaching, I think like a lot of teachers, we need to thrive on growth and variety. And I began to work with, well, I should say actually people started to come to my class with more complicated conditions. And so with that, then I went to extra trainings like a lot of us do. And I really actually took from almost every expert that I could find on, certain populations. Like I was working with a lot of Parkinson's patients and people with multiple sclerosis and neurological conditions. And so that's where I started, as opposed to like the biomechanical, anatomical route that a lot of people, I think, tend to go to, because that's also important. And I did take a lot of those classes and trainings here in New York, as well as up at Kripalu, where I used to assist trainings. And that was one of the ways that I was able to foster a deepening in my education, because I was basically like the person who handled the mic or set up the pillows, but I got to be in the room with a lot of these expert teachers. And so then when I was working with a gentle yoga class with the average age being over the age of probably around 65, 70, and many of them with joint replacements and complex chronic health conditions, someone from Memorial Sloan Kettering came in and sort of secret was it called Secret Shopper, like observed me in several classes without my knowledge. And then she approached me and she invited me to join the team as a yoga teacher. And there I became more exposed to yoga research, and it was a really exciting opportunity for me. I really enjoyed it. And I used to spend my Friday nights, and I would call my husband and tell him I'm coming home at 11 o'clock. I would read research that I had found in some of our filing cabinet up in the offices, or I, learned how to search for articles, and then had a mentor there who was the director of the integrative medicine department, Dr. Barry Casleth, guide me also in how to look at research. And I got to sit in on the research meetings. And then that's really my introduction. And I really read everything I possibly could. And if you read, any of us have read a research paper, you probably think I'm crazy because it's like the driest material ever. Yeah. Oh, and it's funny because I now, I read a ton of studies and a lot of them for school. And I now go through them very quickly, but it used to take me at least like 2 hours to get through one, because I would just go through it and just be like, what do they mean? Or I'd skip over the methodology part or the statistics, and now it's like one of the first things I look at. And so now I have like a method to how I look at a study, and you get better at it as you go along, but it does take an enormous amount of time, actually years, to really understand research and the design of research. And now I'm starting, that was my introduction to quantitative research. And now I'm starting to learn qualitative research methodologies. And it's a totally different bag of skills that you really need to have. And it's much more complex than actually the quantitative, I find.
Could you just define for the listeners what quantitative versus qualitative research is, please?
Right. So quantitative is, to simplify it, it really is like looking at like data-driven, mostly objective measures that, really quantify, like basically distill the information into like numerical data. And then qualitative research is a bit more open-ended. I'm focusing on 5 different methodologies in order to really get a grasp of this type of design. And qualitative is more of like the story of what's going on in the research. A lot of us as yoga teachers instinctively are qualitative researchers, in my opinion. I think a lot of us are always collecting data on ourselves. Like we are our own researchers all the time. We understand what it's like when you sleep 10 hours versus 5. And, we're doing a lot of these sort of like cause and effect type of experiments for on our bodies all the time. We're seeing like, what it's like to do a spinning class and then take a yoga class, or do a yoga class first and then a spinning class, and seeing how, what the effect is, and how are we measuring that in how are we even assessing that, those effects? Are we assessing it, how we feel in that moment, or are we feeling like noticing, health benefits afterwards? Or we're constantly doing research in my opinion. And the qualitative research is looking more about what's going on in that experience. So it's not distilling it into numerical data, but really much more into like someone's experience of the event. And it's translatable into clinical work. So I find reading a lot of the qualitative research helps me to inform a lot of programmatic decisions that I make, both in terms of classes and also in terms of approach.
So the research you're reading, is it about yoga and its ability to benefit some condition or some disease, or is it more generic than that, perhaps about cancer, if that's an area that you're interested in? So what kind of research are you regularly reading?
Okay, I keep a pretty active Twitter feed that shows a lot of the articles that I dove down into. And I honestly keep it, my Twitter feed, I don't know if I should say this, but I really don't care if anyone reads it. I keep it as like my own record. And then I also have a couple other ways that I keep, it's not my only record, but it's like the one that I think that because I follow a lot of exercise oncologists, and I follow on my Twitter feed all of the scientists that I'd want to be at a cocktail party with. And I love that they are constantly promoting and sharing their research. And so there's a couple other places that people can also be in sort of these conversations, or see what's coming out that's in real time, that you don't have to wait for just publications. It's usually ahead of that. Is, obviously at conferences, that's really where the cutting edge research gets released. And I follow a couple conferences a year on Twitter, just alone. I go to a couple conferences every year. I go to about 5 conferences every year. And I'll tell you what those are in a minute and why I go to them. And then I follow on Twitter a number of different conferences. So when they're coming up, I follow the hashtag of that conference. And it's awesome because then I get to see what the buzz is about, who gave the keynote, what they talked about, what the conversation publicly and outwardly on Twitter is occurring. And so sometimes I'll retweet those, and it gives me like this timeline. So I actually will go back in and I'll then file an article in like one of my Dropbox accounts. And I have like ways that I've organized the different studies. But to answer your question, I'm following right now really closely exercise oncology, because as a yoga teacher, I'm curious about the physical aspects of yoga in terms of its relationship to cancer. I'm also interested in the mind, body, and the stress reductive effects of that meditative piece of yoga. And I'm speaking very reductively, and it's not a popular way of viewing yoga. And I know that. It's just the way that when you are putting on your research hat and lens, you have to isolate components in order to be able to understand what's going on there. Otherwise, it's overwhelming. I mean, like yoga is just such a, it's such a huge sphere of different aspects that we participate in, and that's what makes it beautiful. And I think a real lifetime practice for many of us. Many of us, like I don't know very many people who've tried yoga and just don't continue it unless they just really didn't. It wasn't for them. But like a lot of us are really like kind of like still in this, like, what is this? I'm still like that. I'm like, this is pretty amazing stuff. And I've been doing it for, 22 years. I've been teaching it. So I'm interested in those areas because, that's why I chose to go into applied physiology for my academic degree. There's other places that I'm interested in behavioral research as well, adherence. And then there's occasionally like I'll come up with a question. Like recently I've been thinking about, Japan and going back there this summer and thinking about gender roles in my culture and then the culture that I observe in Japan, and how women in the United States are very active and in charge of the health of the family, like the decisions that maintain health behaviors in a family. And thinking about the statistic that you may or may not be aware of, but that married men tend to live longer and single women don't live as long. Single women live longer than married women, and married men live longer than single men. And thinking about what's going on there, it's like, are women, advocating for their husbands, and I believe that this was done in a heterosexual relationship. So I'm assuming that actually right now as I'm speaking about it, but so I don't know if there was some variety in terms of their sample, but thinking about, what is that? And also in my own kind of personal experience with a lot of my friends in my generation, and even thinking about my own family model, a lot of the decisions about like what we ate and our diet, and also making sure that we went to the doctors, were really advocated by the female members of my family. In working in Japan, I've also heard that experience as well, even to the point where certain corporations are bringing on females to their team so that they can have an advantage of advertising to the female decision maker of that particular product. Just thinking about that. So like, doing like a couple searches on that, and then getting some more information around that that question that I have and thinking, okay, so how do I get more information about what's going on here? And, and there's a couple different ways that I could then do my own investigation into that to answer that question. But first, it always begins with a lit review, like what other people are asking the same question and in what arena. And I love, one of the reasons why I love research is I just have a very active mind. And it really, honestly, since I've been involved in research, it's given my active mind a way to engage. And it's just been a really good fit for the way that I think, and thinking outside of the box and constantly turning like a problem on all these different angles, and thinking outside of the realm of a discipline, like, just thinking about yoga research, which I've dived into the research very heavily, but also then thinking, well, who else is answering these questions? Well, in a lot of the interests of like injury prevention, that's in the physical therapy research, and that's in the sport literature, because that's where the funding is for that type of investigation. So you have to be able to like think outside, because we don't want to replicate studies because that wastes money and funds. And we want to answer the question if it's already been answered. We want to be able to provide that information to our community.
Right. That's good. I mean, I like that approach, that it may have already been answered and just it doesn't have yoga attached to it. we need to look a little further than just the yoga studies. But unfortunately, I'm going to bring you back to the yoga studies. And I just was wondering, what's your opinion of how Western research has studied yoga for a while, but not a long time? So it started off, what would you say, 10, 20 years ago as being a research topic. And now it's gotten very different. I've been watching the meditation research because I think that's fascinating. And it started off with self-reporting, and it's now down to measuring how genes change, which is kind of a mind-blowing concept, I think. Mm-hmm. I mean, the genes are either off or on, not that they physically change. But how have you seen research change over your experience with research in the yoga, the movement area?
Yeah, and you're talking about the epigenetics, which is so cutting edge and so exciting. And it's right, because a lot of the ways, the instruments that we're using to look at and measure the effects of these types of interventions and some of the other models of ways of looking at some adaptations. What put yoga on the map, there's actually going to be a speaker at the IAYT puts on those conferences, and it'll be at Kripalu again, which I just love, because one, Kripalu is, where I did my first teacher training in 1996. And I just love the feeling of being there. But the second thing that I can advocate for everyone to go and consider going is that it's really an intimate setting, and it's really just lovely. The food is so good, and it has like these beautiful hiking trails. You really get to know the people who are at this conference, and there's a lot of heavy hitters that they invite every year, but this year they're inviting Karen Sherman. And Karen Sherman really put yoga on the map. She's a significant researcher. And I believe there was a study in 2008. I didn't prepare on this topic. So, I could easily just do like a quick little search just so I'm precise here. But her study on yoga for back pain, and I believe it was chronic, non-specific lower back pain, and looking at it in relationship and comparing it to standard treatment, which I believe is medication at that time. Her studies are very important for us to look at historically. And the reason why I, was hired at a hospital is because her work made yoga more evidence-based. And there's also a couple other studies that are much more in the exercise physiology and what's now called exercise oncology realm, of looking at the epidemiology of that's a self-report, and that's a longitudinal. So it's like over a large span of time, as well as really large numbers of data, and looking at patterns of behavior, of like self-reported behavior. So there's always going to be like recall bias in those studies. And, you have to really kind of like understand, like, we all call into question things now. And I think that's an important skill to have as as you develop your research literacy. But also what we have to take into account is how difficult all of these studies are. I have a great deal of respect for most researchers, even though sometimes I'm like, you can start to see and identify where the flaws are and the limitations are, but still they're adding to the story. And that's one thing we have to remember, is that research pushes the conversation forward. It answers what we don't know. It fills in the black boxes, and it doesn't fill in all the boxes. It's only at certain angles where it's like changing the direction of a single camera in a room. You're just going to get that perspective.
Yes.
And that's the snapshot you're going to get.
No, I agree. My concern is, obviously, it will be more accepted by the Western world if it is more numbers-based. If you can actually measure something before, after, whatever. But the issue is, I think, yes, yoga can be broken down to asanas, which is physical movement. It can be broken down to pranayama, which is the breathing. It can be broken down to meditation. But it is the totality of yoga that I don't understand how we can measure. And yet I admit my bias, which is more on the quantitative area. I wonder how we can really do that, because I think that there is something there that's being missed if you just measure the different parts of yoga.
Absolutely. And that's a given. I agree with you that there are going to be parts that are missed 100%. And that's recognized by those of us in this conversation of research, because there's what's emerging, and it's become popular like in the last 5 years, what some people refer to as like the confession paragraph, where at the end the authors of the study will mention where the weaknesses are, and that's an important thing for them to deliver to the audience and to the reader, so that that maybe it's a researcher that has the capability of answering some of those questions that this particular study couldn't answer. And so when they get presented at a conference, and maybe a keynote, that those two studies can be then held next to each other and say, well, this one said this piece of the story, and this one had this piece of the story. And so together we can have a better idea of what's going on here. And I'm not quite sure if I'm clear about the Eastern and Western delineations that you're making, but you're in Australia, and I looked at where you're at on the map, and it looks beautiful. I'm in New York City. And I'm in the middle of my winter here, and you are having probably a gorgeous summer over there and near water, I see.
Yes.
And in Australia, I think you guys probably have a different way of referring to, Eastern and Western. So maybe you can fill me in so I can help make a point about that.
Actually, I'm from the States. I moved to Australia, and I got my PhD in the States. And I moved to Australia about 17 years ago. So I have had some interaction with Australian researchers in yoga, primarily in the mental health area. And it's slightly different. But what I see is, it's kind of like they're trying, everybody, I don't think it's just Australia, is trying to put together the experiential kind of information that comes from the Eastern traditions, who have, looked at this for literally thousands of years, and trying to marry that with the Western kind of emphasis on research protocols, and you do things a certain way. And I'm lost. I admit that. I want to be able to say that yoga in total does this, because I know instinctively in my body and in my mind that it does, that I always say it gets into your bones. And yet I think it's very, very difficult. I've been trained in research protocols also, and I think it's just really hard unless you go to some research protocols that I don't think are very strong. And so I'm just wondering if I'm wrong. Maybe there are some great research protocols out there that will look at yoga in total and come up with some verifiable results.
Pick out some of the terms that you're talking about and maybe speak to them in a different way. There's the historical piece that you guys are probably a lot more privy to because you're closer to India and have probably an easier way of just getting there to be immersed in that culture and also with the teachers that are there. So there's that difference. And in New York, I really feel like New York is a capital of yoga in the West. It also, I mean, New York has a historical piece of being a movement investigation capital as well, where we had a lot of physical artists come over from Russia in the early 1900s. And, we had a tremendous dance boom here. And there's been a lot of layers of conversation. And also there's just so much information that kind of comes in and out of this area that I really enjoy being a teacher here and being part of this tapestry. And I recognize that, like Japan and which also has its own traditional physical lineages, and then Australia, I'm sure does as well, and preferences, that then you guys are much closer. And so I can recognize the terminology of the Eastern and West. But in terms of the style and design of research, there are a lot of publications and interest in yoga research coming from India. And I think a lot of that is because they're also asking the questions of like, what's going on here? How can we describe this? How can we understand adaptation? How can we understand timeline? Like what I'm hearing from you is maybe if we break it down into, this is where, I'm thinking reductively again, but this is how we have to think is, acute effect, because we do have these studies that are just measuring one dose of yoga and looking at what's happening. And we've also had like a beautiful study that was done at Mayo Clinic of looking at just 15 minutes of Shavasana and looking at biomarkers in the blood. So you have like, pre-test, post-test. So you're looking and comparing between those two measures and looking at it very objectively, and then seeing, and looking specifically at some of the changes in the amount of stress hormones in the blood for people who are distressed, and they were patients. And so, we have a lot of these kind of interesting studies that add to the conversation. And so there won't be one big study. There's a number of meta-analyses that those are always, of course, like a fun thing to read. And this is the messiness of it, I think, is really where qualitative research, which isn't given as much respect traditionally, like at the hospital, I actually, when I was at Memorial Sloan Kettering for almost a decade, and I never read a qualitative study to my knowledge because my chief do not waste your time. We are doing quantitative randomized control trials, the gold standard of research, and this is how we're going to move things forward. And then when I got to Columbia University, I had to look at qualitative research because I needed to understand what was going on. And then looking at the methodologies, I'm really fascinated by how you can be in that messy conversation, especially in like the psych and the mind-body realm. And that might be like a really fun space to explore, and for your community that you're involved in that might be involved in the research is to really look at that, even though your preference is the quantitative, because we do want to have something that we can grasp and speak to.
You said there were 5 models, and there were 5 qualitative research models. Is that correct? Am I saying that right?
There's so many, but I am focusing on 5 just so that I can get a real grasp. I mean, there's probably like 24 different, I think, or 27 is what I remember seeing. But there's also new techniques emerging where, people are starting to do like visual representations of data. For example, I don't know if you've seen the study on like socioeconomic status, where you see like a family and what they eat in 1 week.
Yes, I have seen that.
Laid out on the table. Yeah. And it's an effective, that's qualitative research. So you see a family in Africa, and you see a family in Mexico, and then you see a family in Germany, and it tells you so much information. And it's telling you what's really going on. Now, if we just told you like socioeconomic or buying behavior, or, if we measured it by, time spent at home or time spent as a family, we'd get one side of the story. But then when we see that photo, we learn so much about, one, their health behavior, what they prioritize, what they have access to, what the rest of their life might look like that we can presume. I'm really excited to be learning about this these styles and techniques of looking at the story. So I'll tell you the 5, just in case any of your listeners are interested in reading and maybe even doing like yoga, doing a search on their Google Scholar, the name of the type of research,
Okay.
and then yoga, and seeing what comes up. So narrative research, phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, and case study. And we've all read case studies, right? Because in our yoga incidents, we mostly have case studies. And especially in like our yoga pregnancy and hot yoga, pregnancy, yoga injury or adverse responses, only case study. Because when it comes to human subject research, all of us have to take, or at least in the United States, have to take a pledge where ethically we will not do unethical research. And that's required of us to definitely pledge that. And it's impossible to answer some of the questions that we might have about injuries in yoga, because, how can we possibly make someone do triangle pose when, 18 times a day for 2 years to see what happens to their lower back ethically, or to make pregnant women at different stages of their pregnancy take hot yoga and then see what happens to their babies. I mean, it's just, that's not going to be what we're going to do. And the other thing is that there's not a lot of money behind yoga research usually, although there is some funding, because there's such prevalence of use of yoga. Yoga is getting more and more popular. Every year it's increasing. And not only that, there's a lot more buy-in from the medical community and from other healthcare providers that support the use of yoga, including the mental health realm, and are understanding better how best to use it. Now, there is probably some ceiling effect that we're also not yet clear on in terms of like what's a waste of time and then what's really helpful and to whom.
And those are very important questions, isn't it?
Well, we'll get there. And it's, and then there's even like other breakdowns that everyone's like, why have we not studied that? Like there was 2 years ago at the Yoga Research Conference at Curve Hollow, it was a biomechanics study, I believe I'm saying that right, that she used, I think she used like Flock of Birds, or maybe it was a Microsoft Connect, to mark joint locations and then track it on her computer and then analyze. And she chose to track the degree of motion between, I believe it was from down dog to warrior 1 in 10 advanced practitioners. And she won the Graduate Student Award that year for her research. And I think it was a really important study. And it was funny because I spoke to her at the poster presentation. I immediately thought her work was so important. And then it turned out that she was the award winner. I felt pretty proud of myself for like being like, your work is good. And then she's recognized. I'm like, someone else recognizes that too. And I'm not just like thinking I'm out there, but it's because like, no one had looked at that. Like that's something that, and she wasn't even looking at like joint wear and tear or, muscle biopsy or heart rate. She was looking at whether or not when people stepped forward from down dog in one like action, whether or not their knee went to 90-degree angles or how close it got to that angle. And these were advanced practitioners who had been teaching for at least 10 years. That's where we're at. Like we have one graduate student and she's not continuing in her research. Like she, I think, knows that she, probably won't get very much funding and is choosing to use her skills for some other area. But she, it was great contribution. And then there's been a couple times that I've spoken to other presenters at like, so I'll tell you the conferences I like to go to. Every year I go to the annual ACSM conference, which is the American College of Sports Medicine conference. And that's really a conference for people in the exercise physiology realm and also in the exercises medicine, as well as there's a conglomerate of physical therapists that are now also coming, but there's a lot of like nurses and people who work in physical activity research in all different realms, including Olympic training and Special Olympics. And it's around 7,000 researchers are at the conference. And they're from all over the world, even though it's called the American College of Sports Medicine. And it's really exciting and thrilling. And the things that I learn about and read in terms of the study and investigation are fascinating. And this is all physical activity research, which is really difficult to fund, but things are getting funded. A lot of it from the military, a lot of it from entities like Gatorade, who do like these athletic studies to help support athlete health and also like efficacy of training and all of that. And then we also have like, as well as like even like space studies. So I saw one bracket of presentations on looking at the effects of adaptation after an astronaut comes back down after being up in space, and looking at like muscle atrophy or bone mineral loss, which that could add to your question about bones. So now there's been a couple bone studies of looking at yoga, but they're so small, and bone, as looking at it as an adaptation, it's a longitudinal study. So, minimum 2 years. And that's usually with the DEXA, looking at bone mineral density. But then we can maybe look at like, well, have there been similar types of studies that have looked at weight bearing that's similar to a yoga pose? Mm-hmm. That's where it's like thinking outside of the box to answer your question is helpful into answering what's going on here. Is there tensile as well as more like a mechanical stress on the adaptation processes of bone and preventing, probably for the prevention of bone loss is our public health question. Depending on what's already been found, it's probably something that we can presume is occurring.
True.
And can be helpful.
True. Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcasts that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.